Welcome to Platemark, Series 2, The History of Western Printmaking. My name is Anne Shafer, and I'm your host. I'm here with True Ludwig. Say hi.
Hello.
Hello. This one is part 2 of Dürer.
Dürer.
Dürer is
Yes.
from Nuremberg.
Yes, he has an umlaut. Let's give him his umlaut.
It's very hard for
Yes,
us.
yes. But
Yeah.
don't do it like Uber. It's not Dürer. Okay.
Yeah, it's not easy.
But it's wonderful.
Well, of course it is. All right, so here we are. We are going to start talking about Dürer. I can't even do it now.
Albrecht Dürer.
Thanks a lot.
Sure.
Can't do it now. We're going to start talking about him in a second. Before we do that, we have to do the positionality thing.
Yeah, we better do that.
Okay.
You go for it.
I'll go for it. I identify as a cishet white woman, and I use the pronouns she, her.
And I am a trans, white, gay person who uses the pronouns he, him.
All right. And we are recording this at the Purple Crayon Press.
Booyah.
Booyah, which is a new press in True's house in Charles Village, Baltimore.
Which Anne has learned how to print in.
I know, it's super exciting. When you're a curator, you don't have to have ever done that thing. So lately I've been
learning how to get her hands dirty.
Yeah, it's been super fun.
Yeah, and she's done a really good job.
Thank you.
Quick study.
Thanks. We're in Baltimore, Maryland, as I said, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people. And before we hit Dürer, I wanted to send a shout out to the National Gallery and my former colleague, Rena Hoisington, who is the curator of Old Master Prints there, who has a show coming up starting October 24th, which is called Aquatint from Its Origins to Goya. And True played a special part in the exhibition.
I somehow was remembered by Rena because she had to overhear me doing history of prints lectures.
You're unforgettable, True.
And actually, Rena had me help her with some prints for an exhibition she did at the BMA in 2012. But for this one, Rena wanted to learn how to aquatint because she, as a curator, she hadn't done it. And she is now literally written the book on aquatint. And so she contracted me to come down for a series of visits to look at English, French, Spanish, Italian aquatints and explain what I'm seeing in the process, but then also to teach her and Michelle Fassini, the senior paper conservator, how to do the process. So up here at the Purple Crayon, they learned how to create aquatint plates from, I did all the beveling and preparing of the plates, but they learned we made many test plates so that they could learn about the various ways that you can manipulate light and shadow in terms of burnishing, in terms of time biting, in terms of how many granules of what size rosin could be sprinkled onto the plate and then melted to the plate, and how long it would bite in the acid. And then I taught them how to print them, and we did time biting test scales. And then there was a small, what they decided to do was a small outtake of a larger print by Labruzzi.
Labruzzi?
It doesn't sound very German, does he?
No.
Which is a lovely aquatint. And so I did a blow up of that and ended up scribing and etching and biting and printing. With Marina and Michelle, we printed them. And so the whole step-by-step process will be shown in a display case in the exhibition itself. So that was pretty neat. But it also required that I scribe and bite 10 of the same image on 4x6 inch plates. Time consuming, but a labor of love, and ultimately to see it there. And it's really an incredibly clear step-by-step articulation of this process, which is otherwise pretty hard to understand.
Yeah, aquatint's tough.
But it's also amazingly,
it's glorious.
What it accomplishes in terms of adding atmospheric effects to prints. Goya wouldn't be Goya without aquatint. He's the god of while Rembrandt could do what he does purely with line, all of the folks that came after using aquatint could accomplish so many more things. And it's still used today by artists like Bryce Martin, and Crown Point Press is the exemplar of how to do such things. But just like the home cookery of how some of these printmaking processes started, we did this right here in my home, and the press is in the dining room, and we used mortar and pestle, and we used a heating plate or a griddle, and we used the kinds of battlefield materials that artists of the time would have used to create this process. And so should you happen to go to the exhibition, or should you view it online, you will find a 36 by 40 inch display case with all kinds of loveliness in it. And I actually made those things.
That's right.
Yeah, buddy, right here in this place, which Anna's sitting in, which makes it even more sacred.
I know, it's awesome. Yeah, the show is on from October 24th through February 21, 2022, and the Works on Paper galleries in the West Building on the ground floor is where you'll find these, inner tier.
And the one other thing to keep in mind was that this whole thing managed to go on as the pandemic ramped up, then it occurred, and then we were working in masks and had to make a pact that we were going to work in pods and do all of this. And so now the fact that it's actually on the walls and in the case after all of this pandemic nonsense is nothing short of a miracle.
Right.
So,
yeah.
And so is Aquatint, but I think that's why we continue to work on it so hard.
Right. Well, so congratulations to Rena and Michelle and you.
Why, thank you.
Well, I can't wait to see it.
Yeah, me too.
And honestly, the best part of this is that I'll be able to go see it with you.
Yeah, I was going to say, and then can we do what we do after we go to exhibitions? Wink, 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 wink.
Which is what, go for a drink somewhere?
Duh. It is Anne who introduced me to the wonders of martinis.
It's true. It's my fault.
No, it's not a fault.
Hey, I was introduced to martinis by Susan Dackerman and Helen Molesworth. So,
so there's a whole
there's a lineage here.
Okay, see, we have to keep this up. And nobody mixes a filthy martini the way I like it better than Anne. So.
That's right.
At any rate, maybe that's TMI, but you should know these things. It's like, finding the perfect Aquatint, the proper mixture, the proper twists of lemon or the twists of the scribe, then you've got the best thing ever.
All right, so let's take a micro break, and when we come back, we'll start in on Dürer Part 2.
Right up.
All right, welcome back. We are going to start in on Dürer Part 2. If you didn't listen to the first part, you probably should go back and take a listen because it covers the early part of his life.
It does. And yet it's also, it does really kind of show a break, actually, if one thinks about it, because Albrecht Dürer was born in 1471 and died in 1528. And so in one respect, we can think about how he sits on this absolute bevel, the fulcrum between the medieval and the Renaissance in the North. And I think if we start realizing how much he managed to innovate coming out of the medieval ways and practices of artists and printmakers, and then turn a corner and inaugurate an entirely different way of how images could work towards educating its audience and it's spreading ideas and really showcasing the artist's amazing skill. It's quite phenomenal. And so, also I try to tell my students oftentimes that if you think that in the Renaissance, it's purported that the average lifespan was 40 years. Well, Dürer lived a little bit longer than that. He got to be maybe 56. And so when we'd stopped with a magnificent print called Nemesis, or The Great Fortune. And it starts to show how he's blending the North and the South. We'd also talked just before we concluded that episode about the marvelous Fall of Man, the Adam and Eve print, which shows Adam and Eve standing full frontal with I still think it's a birch tree between them that the serpent is wrapped around with this magical black forest behind them, which is tremendously Germanic, even though the figure of Adam looks like the Apollo Belvedere, and the pose of Eve looks just like the Medici Venus, both of which come from ancient Greco-Roman traditions.
It's like sampling. It's like hip-hop sampling.
It is total sampling.
Hilarious.
And yet it also contains elements from medieval alchemy with these four animals that represent the four humors, and his Albrecht Dürer's ability to interweave the new and the old and the kinds of ideas that he was picking up from the humanists are all completely coming together in this one magical print, which I guess we could call 6 by 8 inches. And so that was, when we start thinking about where he is in his career, we're going to pick up now when he hits 40. And so he's managed to make a great name for himself. And the Nemesis, I believe, is something like 1505. And then he disappears for a while. Well, what was he doing? He was going to Italy again. And he was in Italy from 1505 to 1507. And it's interesting to realize he'd already been there once, from 1494 to 1495. Well,
so we figure it takes like 6 months to walk there. He's there for a year and has 6 months to walk back.
Yeah, well, so I show my students a map and I give them a scale of miles, and it's it's 300 miles just if you could walk in a straight line from Nuremberg to, let's say, Venice. It's in a straight line. Now that doesn't count for Alps and roads, and you can't be a crow flying. You have to be a human, starting to really notice the universe around you, the micro and the macrocosmos, and even noticing how the foliage, the vegetation, the animals, the culture, the people, their morphotypes change as you move over this huge land divide. And imagine going from Nuremberg, what is now Germany, to Venice, at the top of the Adriatic Sea, and you think about how that's the absolute crossroads of where the Silk Road goes through, and you've got every possible kind of humanity from across the globe that can meet there in Venice. And Dürer knows that he already knows of Bellini, who is one of the chief painters there, and he just needs to go see that. Now, one of the things that he already is aware of after having come back from his first trip is just how differently Italy views its artists. And I want to remind our listeners that he was a painter as well as a printmaker, although we remember him really for his prints. He was an aces.
We do, but I think most people do.
But he was an aces painter.
Sure.
Yeah, and you just want to look at his self-portraits and you'd melt. He knew how to do that, but he also realized he could make a lot more money with his prints, and because those, of course, you can spread far and wide, and a painting can only usually be in one place in someone's permanent collection. But I wanted to bring to mind, I found this quote very recently, and he had said in a letter to his friend Willibald Pirkheimer, who was a leading humanist of the day. I mean, incredibly important to the history of how things changed from the former times to post-Reformation. He had said, in Italy, he says, "Here I am a gentleman, at home a parasite."
What?
Yeah, because, you've got that concept of the Renaissance idea of genius by this time in Italy. When you think about 1505, you got the Ninja Turtles, right? Donatello's a guy from the prior century, but Michelangelo is high form. He's just finished the ceiling, or he's at work on the ceiling. Raphael is stealing peaks at the ceiling and working on his Stanza della Signatura. And Leonardo's doing whatever the hell Leonardo wants, because he's already done Mona and he's doing this and that and the other thing. And but it's the cult of genius there. They're starting in Italy. They respect that incredible life ability that's of the muse, that was the gift that was either given to them by God or given to them by these outside forces, because genius was actually regarded as a person more than a person being a genius. You were blessed with a genius, the genius of the dance, or the genius of and it was in a way, it's almost their, it's not just their, I think of it as not just their birthright, it's also imperative that they make use of those skills. And so when you think about him coming back over the Alps and saying, "Here I am a parasite," because you're just another workman. Yeah, so you arose through the guild system. You were an apprentice to your dad, and then you got sent over to your uncle Anton Koberger's shop, working with the printmaker there, and you are still part of a guild, which is a group of workmen. So you go from being an apprentice, then you do your Wandeljahre, or some would call it your gap year, but it's your journeyman period. And then you do your masterpiece and you're admitted to a guild. But even so, it's not the same. That's a medieval concept as opposed to this creative genius of an artist in Italy.
It's so fascinating that the same time period in the same continent, divided by the Alps, that these two different ideas of what that is could be so different. Well,
let's talk about New York and Texas after this past week in the news.
Yeah.
And think about how wildly divergent ideas of what human right can be, or what is law, and what you can do to the law to make it do what you want it to do. And it could be that that's what, not picking fights here, but that could be what the church was even doing with how it was being administered in Italy, through the Roman Catholic Church. You get the Pope and the cardinals, and then all the way down through the system. And in the North, it's the same thing, except they're so far flung afield. They've got these priests, but they're not getting the same attention. And so it doesn't surprise me that a guy like Luther will eventually get fed up with the system and say, this is what needs to happen so that all citizens have an equal right to this gift of grace from God, as opposed to needing this whole structure, this whole scaffolding of the Catholic Church. And, all of that was brewing at exactly the same time that Dürer was doing what he's doing. And so, in many respects, Reformation would have existed without printmaking or without the Renaissance. It's that spreading of ideas. So I thought maybe what we could do is pick up with Albrecht coming back up to Nuremberg and starting what he's doing. Oh, by the way, he had managed to start his own print shop. And, I read recently that he was only able to do that if he was married.
What?
Yeah. And he had married.
Wait, how can that be?
Come on. It was you had to be
the
married.
rules, my God.
I know. We'll go to Texas, honey. Actually, just thank Ruth Bader Ginsburg, okay?
Right.
Because those wives, anyway, there's a whole thing about how he actually didn't really enjoy his wife one iota. And like the minute
he wasn't gay, right?
Well,
do we not know?
Well, I've recently read, and this is never in anything I read when I was coming up.
Of course,
was that maybe he was bisexual.
Oh, okay.
Well, okay, fine, but maybe he didn't enjoy his wife at all. But the fact was that he married her, and then boop, instantly went to Italy the first time. And he was away for a year, and then he comes back, and he writes to Pirkheimer about what a old crow she is.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
But they had children, right?
Well, they did all that.
I know they.
Some. Yeah, they did. And they had a very fine house, and she ended up being, his business agent because she's one of the people that would pack his prints in barrels to ship them. But, she's also married to one of the guys that has the nicest houses in Nuremberg by, 1511. So it worked out, as most marriages probably do.
Partnership, right?
Partnerships, indeed. Right. It's not... Our concept of marriage these days can't even be remotely the same. And sometimes, I'm sorry, sidebar, I wonder if maybe the arranged marriages of India last longer because they're partnerships, they're business relationships, as opposed to,
right.
It's about love.
Yeah.
Because there's, he was a businessman, and we can tell that, not just because he was a great painter, but because the world knows him, because he was a savvy dude. And so here we're going to start about 1511. And in the space of 2 years, let's say, when he's hit 40 years old by 1511, in the next 2 years, he essentially publishes 5 different things. He does a republishing, a reedition of the Apocalypse, because it had, the world didn't end in 1500, and we discussed that last time.
Would they have recreated the blocks?
Oh, blocks were still floating around.
They should be still.
Oh, yeah. No, it was just a second edition.
Okay.
Yeah, and they're his blocks. Oh, and I do have to. I hate this too.
There are. You can find them. They're still around, right?
I can't tell you that, but what I can tell you is that there's still a debate about whether or not he cut them.
Right.
Which is annoying to me, but in one respect, no matter what, he was the Reiser. He designed them.
Right.
Perhaps he glued the drawings to the blocks and handed them off to form cutters, but he also had to know what the wood could or could not do.
Right.
You can't know that unless you do it.
Yeah.
There's no way you can know that. It's saying, this is a woodcutter myself telling you this.
Right.
And nobody took the art of woodcut further than Dürer. I mean, there's only so much a piece of wood can do, but he seemed to understand how to make that happen. So if they were carved by someone else, it was still tremendously consistent, and it's all his design. So I wanted to keep that in mind. But at the same time, he had come up with another group of prints. It's the Woodcut Passion, the Large Woodcut Passion. I think Anne's probably going to register a real happy remembering face on that one, because the Large Woodcut Passion is something that we would show. The BMA is privileged to have, I don't remember if we have all of them, but we have, of the Ecce Homo, we have the printed, and we have as printed and then as hand colored,
right?
Because that was part of Susan Dackerman's The Painted Print Show,
right?
And I still think that Dürer probably would have just chewed his molars off thinking about somebody painting his woodcuts, which graphically could stand on their own, because he manages to create that middle gray tone, as Panofsky says. He manages to create gray when all you have is black and white with a relief print. However, we would show the students part of this Woodcut Passion, and the plates themselves are probably 12 by 14, 11 by 14, something like that. And they're really marvelous and excellent, and even more easily read than the ones from the Apocalypse. There's a little bit more design and order to them. And so it's 11 woodcut plates. The scenes, it's interesting how he has come to realize that using a cycle, as in serial imagery, is phenomenally useful, and that's something that the print can do so readily. It has its title page, and I'm pretty sure that I can't tell. I suppose those were probably, letterpress letters.
The text, yeah.
Yeah, but the images read so clearly, and you can really understand how Christ, from the moment he's, enters Jerusalem to where he's carrying the cross to where he's crucified at Golgotha, the place of the skull, he has become ever more like a film director,
right,
and understanding how to create these scenes. It's not on just some plain old rigid verticals and horizontals, but if you look, you can start to realize that there are way more diagonals in the way that the scenes are composed. And in part of my mind thinks that's a trait he might have picked up in Venice, because if you think about Titian and many of those other, especially Titian.
Composition, yeah.
Yeah, compositionally, it's far more radical and racy than it would have been up north. They used a lot of diagonals to add sweep and emphasis to their compositions. But it still has, the Large Woodcut Passion, imagine 11 large plates in black and white, but would still have these little genre elements. Like the one that Ann and I are looking at right now is Christ falling as he's carrying the cross. And he's right outside the castle gates of Jerusalem. Yeah, right. But this is a Dürer thing. I adore.
That could be the city wall.
A city wall, yeah. With a portcullis that could come down, which I'm pretty sure wouldn't have been back in biblical times. And the marvelous foliage that around at his feet, but also mountains in the distance and a tree. But he always does this beautiful thing with a little scattering of birds, and just those tiny little things, or the glaive, this combination spear and axe that
as a glaive?
A glaive.
Oh, glaive.
Apparently, my buddy who was into that kind of stuff.
That's so bizarre, because when you said glaive, I went straight to Princess Bride, and also when you said the portcullis.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Leslie, get the portcullis!
Well, it's the same time frame. This is totally Princess Bride stuff.
That's hilarious.
Think about it. The man in black is up the rope, and you keep saying that word. I do not think you means you think what it means.
But the other thing about narrative, narrative was not anything new, but surely he would have. Is that Schongauer, the Christ carrying the cross?
Yes.
Has the vignettes that are happening simultaneously.
Yeah, the 3 vignettes within one large horizontal frame.
Right.
Which is interesting because it is, it's a scroll in a way of watching Christ. We should include that one so they can see in one large horizontal, very large horizontal.
It is big.
For a copper plate, it's insanely big. But it'll show Christ stumbling, carrying the cross, the Holy Family watching this happen and in tears, and then the place where he's going to basically arrive, where the cross will be planted and he'll be crucified. So you can see these different stages in the story. Dürer really does give you this almost a film frame. I think he divides things up, serial imagery. I think he makes them, I think at first glimpse, they're so eminently readable. But if we get into things like the 3 Meister prints of 15, 13, 14, it's so laden. That's TV for hours and hours and hours. Nevertheless, these woodcut, the Large Woodcut Passion, has the scenes, and it has, contemporary people wearing those kind of, medieval tights and the stuff you'd see at the Renaissance Festival. And poor Christ with his crown of thorns, just haggard and having fallen to his knees. But you can tell that this would address a certain audience who could afford a Large Woodcut Passion, because in the same year, he presents his Small Woodcut Passion, smaller plates, and I would say they're maybe 5 by 7, 4 by 6, much smaller, which of course only forces you to contract what you will show in the same scene. Does it make it more affordable? There were 37 plates in that particular series cycle. And so that's another take on it. So imagine this.
So for different audiences.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. So I'm thinking the large ones for scale, those would be something you could actually put up on the wall at home should you wish. Or, if it's like the small one, the small woodcut passion, that could be in your Kunstkammer. You'd have your little print collection. You could take it out and share it with people. You could have, and not just share as in, ooh, isn't that cool? Look, there's a dog, but as in reinterpreting or re-imbibing the text. Because the whole point was that Dürer was a very devout human being. He was a God-fearing soul. He was illustrating or putting these stories to the world, not just because he was like, hey, here's some cool stuff and I know it's going to sell well, but because he was a man of faith. And it is well documented in his belief in the higher powers and how he was telling the story. And so, when we think about those kinds of things, if you look at how he humanizes the Passion, for instance, in the same year, he also puts out his engraved Passion, which is 16 plates.
So that's a lot of carving / engraving.
Right.
To
and
be
so
done in a
one
year.
would say that certainly by this time, maybe he carved the Apocalypse himself, but logic would dictate that he had, in those years that he had come back from Italy, that he had designed these things. He'd managed to get, maybe he'd farmed out the large plates to, and there were woodcut or Formschneider firms now. And that's, but those were.
So he didn't have his own workshop.
I can't tell you that. I'm sure that a Brazilian artist, I can't tell you that, but I'm sure that with all of the ink that's been spilled over him over these hundreds of years, that somebody would have a thought about that. But don't forget, he's also part of Anton Goldberger's, he's still his godson and he's still got access to the,
over there.
Volgamut's workshop. So, but that also tells you that the woodcut artist had to have come up quite a chunk because of the nature of the work that he himself had created in that whole doorway that he'd opened. So you got a large woodcut Passion for people who could have widescreen TVs. You've got a small one for people who could be reading it maybe on their iPad or, the size that, literally the engraved Passion is the size of your cell phone.
Right.
Really, no bigger than that. And you could scroll through that whole story as though you would be, there are 16 plates from the engraved Passion, and they're exquisite. And then remembering that engraving and woodcut have completely different characters. And engraving allows itself to have so much more tone and being able to have these lines that have been sized, been carved into the plate. There's no way anybody but Dürer engraved these plates. There's no way. It's his mark.
Well, I don't know a lot about Dürer, so don't hold me to this, but 37 blocks carved by people who do that professionally versus 16. It makes sense that he would do far fewer plates.
Oh, yeah. But even so, the 16 plates, that's quite a number.
That's a lot.
And the other thing that's interesting is that they've been able to parse out that some of the bigger hitting parts of the Passion, like the Crucifixion, he had done much earlier. You do some of the 5 biggies, and then you can infill with the other things. So the Crucifixion, what Ann is seeing is, I've got my PowerPoint open, and what you can see is the Crucifixion, which was done many years earlier, maybe as many as 10 years earlier, and then one of the later ones where he's carrying a cross. And it describe for me how you see this carrying of the cross, if you can. Sorry about that squeak.
That's okay.
But if you think about him carrying the cross and how in each of these, Dürer has given a different kind of presence. In the small woodcut Passion, Christ is totally fallen on his knees and he's cowering, and it looks like the whole world is going to beat him up. And here in the engraved Passion, for people who could afford engravings, which was for a much higher class, higher educated clientele, look how Christ is carrying the cross.
Well, it feels more like, while of course he's in pain because he's carrying this cross and he's got the crown of thorns on his head, that he's it's almost like he's already transitioned into kind of the Messiah that he was born to be, that he's almost out of body and allowing the people along the road to kind of touch him to get comfort. Or
he's far more elegant. He's upright. He's not cowering, right? He's like, yes, he's suffering, but he's doing so with dignity. Yeah. I mean, it is a really dignified, there's some torment on his face, but he's literally standing up. while the rest of the world is like, it's like a scene where the villagers are coming with their glaives and their spears and their stabbies and their hackies, and they're all ganging up around him. And yet he's at this beautiful X marks the spot in the center of the plate, while all the grizzled people are around almost in a halo of stupidity around him.
And the other thing about the comparison, the crucifixion scene from earlier is, that may be a lesser impression.
I think it's later, yeah.
Meaning that the inking didn't carry as well in the lines.
I think the plate may have already degraded a bit by the time he's printing this next
But
one.
it feels less detailed. There's less range of light to dark. He hasn't totally hit it yet, but it's great. It's already, already Dürer, for sure.
But it's not. It almost looks like B-side Dürer as opposed to A-side Dürer,
well said, yeah.
And the other thing that I think is fascinating is if you look at the figure of St. John in the crucifixion from the engraved Passion, he's wringing his hands on the right hand side, and honestly, that's a pose that he had studied in a Montagna print. Yeah. And he's kind of taken that pose and lifted it wholesale and rotated it just a little bit towards us. So he's still blending these interesting traditions. Although the physical nature of Christ there, in terms of the anatomy, it's very well realized. It doesn't look Northern Renaissance. It looks factual. And in that way, we would say it looks more Italianate, because if it was a Northern Ren, it'd be far more tortured and it wouldn't be quite as proportionate. Well, he still has that important
But look at the cloth that floats back behind him.
That is so Northern Ren.
It is.
Isn't it interesting? Because there's this very proportionate figure with sinews, muscles that are all completely readable, hanging from the cross. And yet, the drapery from his loincloth has literally whipped around and flying behind him, which becomes part drapery and part activator of the scene.
And filler of that dead space.
Because it would be, if it was just all horizontal lines, it wouldn't have that. But it's almost as though it's like fabric angels. If you think about it, angels would fill those spaces, but he's not including those because that would clutter this concept. Because it needed to be dark. When Christ dies on the cross, the earth, it was in the height of the afternoon, but the earth becomes as dark as night. Well, he reads those things, but here, and when we look at the carrying of the cross, it's just so dark, and it's just like the darkest moments of humanity, And so I think I keep seeing him taking things deeper and figuring them out more and more and more. So the woodcut passions for different audiences, the engraved passion for a much different audience that could afford engraved plates, because printing those is far more time consuming. And they know they're going to put them in their container. Now, when we showed these to the students, how many, do you recall? We had a fair number of these in the...
Oh gosh, I'd have to
I think we had virtually all of them.
Why a collector would only have
exactly. I think, remember, we had, of the Altdorfer, we had 38 of the 40.
Oh, that was irritating.
Yes, indeed. And then you fixed it. When we get to Holtzius, I'll give you the Anne Triumph story. However, it's just realizing that it's almost like you have to get them all. And I would imagine that, of course, he sold them separately because the crucifixion, he was already selling that. But the engraved Passion as a whole, he put them all together, put them on the compilation album, and there you have it. Of course, I'm still thinking an LP and everybody else is an EP, and I don't know what the hell that means. However, another one that he printed in the same year, that he was putting out these other ones, is The Life of the Virgin.
Yeah, another series.
And it's 19 woodcut plates with poems. Now, I want for you to just sort of describe, if you would, the title page.
Yeah, the title page has some large small cap text across the top, and in the center there's a Virgin Mary holding the baby Jesus sitting on like a crescent moon sort of thingy, and some pillows and lovely northern drapery. And then below, I assume that's the text of the poem.
It is.
Yeah.
Now, it's a great looking title page, and again, this would have probably been a set of prints sold separate, sold loose leaf, not bound. But
the weird thing is, like, I can't even find the title.
Well, I have news for you. First, I want you to look at that title, and I'm going to go back to, look at the title on this small woodcut Passion, or even on the on the Large Woodcut Passion, and it looks like Fraktur, right?
Right?
The Northern Germanic, hand-lettered by monks, kind of difficult to read, Biergarten kind of letters. Look at the print, the font.
It's Roman.
Yes, it is. Roman? Why, isn't that Italian? Why, yes, like Times New Roman.
Right.
That's the same style of lettering.
And it's the style of lettering that you would see on monuments.
Exactly. And below, it's not in Fraktur.
Even in the small caps.
Yes, and even in the Fraktur, it's more in a Roman font, upper and lower case. It doesn't look like it's handwritten with a pen. And so in this particular cycle, I think it's fascinating because it's the life of the Virgin, which is completely apocryphal, but meaning it was not, they take little squibs out of the Bible, but they've concocted this life of the Virgin outside of the Bible because...
And now who was they? Like,
they, the monks, Anne looks so righteously indignant.
Well, I mean, and for what purpose? Righteous living or?
Yeah, well, think about this. Actually, it's wonderful for us to be able to be annoyed by this now, but if you think about, if we were to look at the history of art history and about how when the Christians managed to come out of the catacombs and were allowed to practice their faith after Constantine had said, sure, okay, I'm a Christian, you guys can have your faith, and it's probably going to help the Roman Empire not fall apart for another 70 years. Then Christianity rises, and at the time, Christ is this kind, loving, young, beardless, good shepherd. He's a loving, kind young man. And through the course of the next 700 years, like let's think about the church domes of 1100. By then he has become this Pantocrator, and he's this large guy, and he's in a 23-foot across thing with his glowering face and this beard, and he's terrifying, and he's that guy you would see at the Last Judgment. He's really freaking terrifying. And it's interesting to me to see how the church has taken this kind, loving, good shepherd in the year, let's say 400, and then taken him to this wrathful, vengeful guy that will fuck you up some years later. And then there's this warming in the 12th and the 13th century, and there's this new interest in the Virgin Mary. It's this whole Marian thing, and it's like, oh, and there's more attention paid to her as the kind, loving mother of Christ.
Humanizing
him and her, because she's relatable, and people could have her intercede on their behalf to Christ. So even if you look at medieval church facades, you'll see that she and St. J the B, John the Baptist, are sitting on either side of him up there on the big throne at the final judgment. It's like, it's as pecking orders come back, and you're the little bitty guy in the middle, and there's some angels, and then up there is Mary and St. John the Baptist, and they could say, so Christ. Anne has been pretty good, and Anne was good enough to share great martinis with True for 10, 12, 15 years. And I really think that we can forgive some of Anne's other sins and let Anne into heaven, and Christ will go, oh, okay. This concept of the Marian image became very popular. And as you say, it was becoming more and more of a way to help train young ladies in how they could comport themselves. Even in Florence, there's a tremendous sidebar, but even in Florence, if you watch the humanizing of the Virgin by the mid 1400s, they started putting up terracottas. The Luca della Robbia, the della Robbia brothers were putting on these beautiful terracotta roundels of the Virgin Mary, very blonde, with a very blonde, very cherubic baby Jesus on her lap that would smile at you down from the corners of various buildings in Florence, which were a way for young ladies to go, ah, yes, I need to aspire to be that. It's not, ah, yes, I'm going to fucking burn in hell and die. Oh my God, I'll be rent asunder by demons. It was, oh, I can aspire to this.
It's the fucking patriarchy.
Well, duh. I'm sorry. I know. Well, sorry. They exist, right? They'll.
I cut that.
No, you're not. You should leave the because I just thank you, Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Right.
Let's see how it's cyclical, right? We got to get it all back. And thank you, Amazons. Not Amazon, the company, but the women.
Amazonians.
Yes. Now, back to the concept of this Life of the Virgin, 1511. It's 19 woodcut plates with poems. But the poems, again, aren't necessarily with the images. And I wanted to share something humorous with you. Well, first, it is that the actual title, which you can see all in Roman lettering, actually reads, Excerpts from the Story of Holy Virgin Mary presented in pictures by Albrecht Dürer with verses by Sheldonius.
Who's Sheldonius?
Oh, he's a monk who came up with these poems. But the whole point here is that it's a story in pictures.
Durer's above the title.
Of course he's above the text. Again, like I see a full circle. I see the Bible, the apocalypse text.
Marquee.
Yes, is on the back. The apocalypse is on the back of the sheet, and the virgin story is on the face. Well, think about this. I'm showing Anne a picture of this life of the Virgin, and here's an opportunity where you can see him blending north and south in a phenomenal way. Walk him through this particular scene. Is
this the death?
No, it's just walk him through the scene.
Okay, so we're in an interior, and the Virgin is cradling the baby Jesus.
Or she's just had him. Yeah, she's just had him, and they're tending her.
Okay, so she's in bed.
Wait a minute, she's in what?
She's in a bed.
A bed with curtains on it?
With big draperies.
And tassels, sort of like this really beautiful Renaissance kind of interior.
Yeah, it's bizarre.
Well, no, that's how you have babies in 1511. Keep going. So what else are you seeing?
Well, let's see. Is that the St. Michael? Oh, down in the corner there? Okay, there's lots of attending women.
And they're all washing the baby and cleaning him up.
Giving him a bath.
Yeah, and then they're going to, present him back. And up above, yes, there's an angel hovering above the pie crust cloud saying, this is a holy birth. But if you covered up that angel and you just looked at what's below.
It's very genre.
It's absolutely a woman having a baby at home in bed with her family attending them, and all the ladies going, oh, look at his little toes. Aren't they so cute? Because look how incredibly real and ordinary this would have seemed. They're fully clad.
There's a lot of them, though.
There are a lot. Well,
a lot of women.
Well, maybe it was a big deal. Maybe, But what else do you see about the room that this bed is in?
Well, it's bizarre because there's a stairwell in the back there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, no bedroom has a stairwell in it.
Well, okay, so you've got a stairwell, you've got a fireplace, you've got a bigger fireplace, you've got a window leading out to the outside world, you've got a wall that comes in at a oh my goodness, yes.
Perspective.
And so he's taken you with all of those angles of the fireplace hearth and the table, and he's zoomed us back into the middle background, which is where the bed is, right? And he's given you linear perspective, which he learned in Italy. Yes. And he's learning picture construction. He's showing that, which he learned in Italy. And you notice the geometries that he's using in that. And yet he still has that wonderful kind of Northern Renaissance pie crust cloud with the angel above, so that it's showing that this sacred moment is happening here on earth.
So there's Italy, genre, Reformation. This is fascinating.
It's pre-Reformation, but it is totally humanized this whole story of the Virgin Mary, and it's really quite endearing when you think about it. He's taken this to a point where anybody could really be enjoying this cycle of images, and they're little poems by the monk Sheldonius, which happened to be related to, and he composed these scenes based on those poems. It's also fascinating to see how at times, like with the apocalypse, he would have extrapolated from the biblical text or compressed things. But this is pretty literal, straight ahead, scene by scene by scene by scene of this life of the Virgin.
Was
Sheldonius?
Thank you. Was he contemporary?
I think he was slightly earlier. But yeah, I think slightly earlier, but not terribly much.
Right.
And the other thing I wanted to point out to people about this one, because again, I think about artists and they're people. They're not just these masters. And relating it to this concept of mastery, tell me about that point of view that we have in a scene.
You mean that we're sort of up in almost not bird's eye, but
a raised view, and we're
almost like we're an angel looking down on them, or
looking, or we've broken through a window that above the room to see them.
Right.
And in other scenes from this cycle, he has different ways of viewing up and into the room or over into the room. And what he's doing, I finally realized, he's creating a series of images with new points of view, like Orson Welles did in Citizen Kane. Orson Welles was the first one to complete fully formed sets with ceilings and floors and to create an entire space for his actors to live in, and would break that fourth wall and would take us down those long vistas. And that's one of the things that Dürer is starting to do here with these. If you go through the whole cycle, you start to realize that they're very filmic.
Yeah.
And nobody, of course, knows what film is in 1511.
Well, right. So where would he have even come up with that idea? Well,
pointing to head.
Yes.
This is the stuff that he's putting together from north and south, and even
he is a genius.
Yes, he is. And the thing is, that we don't really take into account really how very well read he must have been.
Well, right. I mean, he was a human. I think people.
He was friends with Pirkheimer. He was reading Erasmus. He knew all of these things, and he's gobbling up at weights that we don't quite realize until you think about the books that he published late in his life, that he understands geometry, which is considered one of the most essential things that an artist can know, which of course Micah students go, I don't like math, it's scary. But you had to.
I love geometry.
Of course, because you can see it. He understood Italian mathematicians. He would take notice of Euclidean geometry or the Platonic solids. He had this vast array of knowledge that goes way deeper than I think any of us really, really realize until you look through those later books. They're all coming together in this filmic array of images, which, as you can now understand, would be so popular because they make the story of the life, the birth of Jesus, and the whole story of the Virgin Mary as a human being and up to her death, something so believable, so real, so contemporary, so now that it was astonishing to people and it was incredibly well known. Now, Dürer had been working on this cycle for a while, and some of those plates had actually managed to make, or some of the prints had actually managed to make their way down into Venice.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So much so that by 1506, there was an engraver in Venice named Marcantonio Raimondi, who would eventually become quite a big deal, who saw them and thought they were really, really cool. And he made copies of them, and he engraved copies of them, and he put AD.
Which is so interesting because they're after other engravings, not.
He made engravings after woodcuts.
Oh, after the woodcuts, right?
Yeah, but yeah, right,
yeah,
and they complete with the AD Albrecht Dürer monogram,
right.
And he's selling them. And when Dürer gets down there in 1506, he says, "What the hell are you doing?" And he realizes that he's being filched. And he takes his case to the Venetian Senate. And the Venetian Senate's like, well, these are okay, yeah. So Marcantonio Raimondi, you can continue to make these engraved impressions, but you can't put AD on them anymore.
Which is sort of not really
fair,
right?
To our way of thinking,
correct.
But if he doesn't put AD on them, then he's not
still someone else's stuff,
right? So I wanted to share with you, I guess now would be a good time to share with you this other cool fact that sometimes I share and sometimes I don't. Eventually, actually the very next year, he becomes he's the court artist for Maximilian I. And one of the things...
Dürer is, and Maximilian is in
Emperor.
Rome?
Emperor. He's the Holy Roman Emperor up in Germany landish, where Dürer is. And you'll find, before we complete this episode, I hope, that Dürer has become a very important, propagandist for Maximilian.
Oh.
However, Dürer's next step was to attain the very first copyright in a special grant from Emperor Maximilian. He proclaimed his new right in the 1511 Life of the Virgin. I remember he had taken this guy to court in 1506 for stealing some of his images. So in this same printed thing with that long title saying these are all prints by Albrecht Dürer, I'm reading a quotation now. It says, "Hold, you crafty ones, strangers to work and pilferers of other men's brains. Think not rashly to lay your thievish hands upon my works. Beware, know you not that I have a great grant from the most glorious Emperor Maximilian, that not one throughout the imperial dominion shall be allowed to print or sell fictitious imitations of these engravings? Listen, and bear in mind that if you do so, through spite or through covetousness, not only will your goods be confiscated, but your bodies also placed in mortal danger."
What, he printed this somewhere in like a newspaper?
He printed it with this.
Oh, with it?
Yeah.
Like a colophon?
Yeah. Like, don't steal my shit.
Oh my God.
Because you're in mortal danger if you do.
Oh, that's hilarious.
I think that's pretty... More power to him.
He's a badass.
He is. But, imagine going someplace and seeing somebody stealing all your good stuff and then saying, hey, look, I made these engravings of this Life of the Virgin. Aren't I a smarty? He's just taken wholesale Dürer's ideas, his readings, his viewpoints. Yes, indeed. So that's just the life of the Virgin. So
nice.
Yeah. Oh, and one other thing about the death scene from the Life of the Virgin from this.
Yeah.
There's this dude in the 17th century that also owned a Dürer's.
Oh.
Little Rembrandt dude.
Yeah.
His Death of the Virgin that he puts out in 1639.
Right.
He gets that composition from
Dürer.
Albrecht Dürer.
Right.
Pretty cool, right?
It is cool.
It is kind of a big line. Okay.
Like if you're gonna, go ahead and own one thing from the early part of printing, like I don't know how you could not have a Dürer.
Well, that was Anna and I were discussing that earlier this.
Oh, right, and you committed.
I said I would go for the book of St. John Devouring the Book, but hey, man, I would go for a toenail that was carved. Seriously, I don't care. I mean, there just has to be a little piece of Dürer in this house, along with my Daumier and my Goya and my baskets.
Right. Yeah, so we were talking about in the last episode, Dürer Part 1, about which of the Apocalypse we would want to own if we could, but also recognizing how much money they're now bringing. The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse went for $800,000 or something at auction in 2013. But if you will come across lesser known Dürers and Rembrandts and all sorts of things that will be well within your range, probably.
But now we have to get to the big three.
The big three, these are the best
the
ever.
Master engravings. If Dürer never did anything else, it's these three engravings that he does in 1513, 1514. And they're all essentially the same size. And they could be read together, but they could certainly stand alone. They're very different in appearance. And rather than me...
They make so much sense as a
group. They do. But here's the other thing, because they're so rich in content, each of them. It's not just the subject matter of a guy on a horse or a guy sitting in a room writing in a book or some grumpy lady sitting there looking in the middle distance with all sorts of cool stuff sitting around her. That's the subject matter. The content is so deep and so various and so wonderfully pulled together. Each one is a vast meal. And so I'm going to have to shut up a lot, but I'm going to let Anne talk to you a little bit about this very first one that we're looking at. The first one in this series of three is Night, Death, and the Devil. That's Night, Death, and the Devil. And it's an engraving. And I would say that it is, let's say, 7x9 max. It's not big at all.
No, well, it feels big.
Because when we taught history of prints, one of the others from this little set of three was there was a blow up of it on the door.
Right.
Yes, and it was like 2 by 3 feet.
Yeah.
And it looks perfectly fine and perfectly normal. And yet you got to take your fingers and go, pinch it down like you are on your phone to something that is half the size of a tablet.
And do we know that he did Night, Death, and the Devil before the other two?
Yes.
We do know.
Yeah, he actually...
Because of the date.
Yeah, it was nice of him. He put the date on there.
Okay. That was nice.
It was nice. I think it's important to realize that he's 42 when he's doing that.
Huh.
Right?
Yes. Yeah, so you want me to describe this? Is that what's happening?
Well, sure, because, you've looked at it a few times.
I have. All right, so Night, Death, and the...
So describe it, Anne. Describe what... We know it's great.
It's true.
But why is this so mesmerizing?
I feel like it has everything in the kitchen sink. Like it has a myriad of textures. It has really cool, weird animals and ghouls and demons and death. And I don't know, and the composition's incredible. The
composition is astonishing right off the bat. And
right.
I think the case could be made that, if we were to think about setting up a composition like on a grid with horizontals and verticals, I actually put this out for my drawing students, and I do a diagram on top of it where you can see that exactly halfway through the plate describes the back of the horse, and then if on the exact vertical that bisects it, the knight is absolutely dead center. But then you could start doing diagonals with the sword into the landscape, or the lance that does this other X, and you start realizing that he's using these kinds of diagonals, which I think he really would have picked up on when he was in Venice, because they're far more experimental with compositions in Venice. People like Titian and the like. It's just not something, this kind of compositional concept would not be something that he would have stumbled on in the North. It's just not to mention just the way the horse and the rider are put together. Now, I want you to tell us more about what they look like.
Oh, great. So in the center, we have this knight in his shining armor riding astride a horse who is muscular and erect and beautiful and looks just like he's ready to go where he's going. And then they have their little dog, Fido, down
that
there.
nice silky little dog.
Silky hound.
He's literally like he's trotting along beside. He's in action, right? Look at his little fluffy ears trailing behind.
And the thing that's so cool, I mean, I think the whole point of it is that the three of them are a unit, and they are the sort of boldly going where no person has gone before, and they're not going to be deterred by these things that are trying to tempt them in the wood. Right.
And then behind them, as you've rightly pointed out before, on the left-hand side, who's holding up what?
Well, that's Death with the hourglass.
What doesn't he look kind of terrifying?
He is terrifying. He's kind of like half skeleton. He looks like Skeletor.
Yeah, but with snaky hair, and he's got his horns and whatnot. And then
and he's on a pale horse.
Yes, he is on a pale.
Winkety wink.
Yeah, which actually, if you think about it, looks a lot like the pale horse as opposed to this new horse here.
Right.
And then so that'd be death, and then so it's night, death, and
the devil.
And look at what's the devil made of?
Well, the devil has this weird sort of curved horn on the top of his head, which is kind of curved the wrong way. And he always looks like he has earrings to me, but I think those are those more horns that are curling.
Yeah.
Yeah, it always looks bejeweled to me. I don't know why.
It's the first time I've ever noticed it like that. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and he's
creepy ears and scaly and furry.
It looks like a boar crossed with an anteater crossed with a drag queen or something.
Which also seems like he's like Dürer snagged all of the ickiest parts out of Schongauer's Temptation of St. Anthony and just smushed them all together in this nasty image of the devil. And below, you can even see his cloven hoof.
Oh, right.
Which is, so he's got kind of that satyr-like kind of, and he's got a totally creepy tail, too.
Yeah, the tail is creepy. And then what's that thing called? A grave?
The glaive?
Glaive?
Yeah, the thing that's like maybe half spear, half axe.
Yeah.
All right, so, and then behind them is what? Like, look at the roots in it. What's behind them?
Well, there's sort of this rocky outcropping. He's kind of going by a cliffish thing that has some blasted trees growing up out of it, and in the far distances, the shining city on a hill.
Mm-hmm. As though he is the soldier of Christ armed with his faith, which is actually essentially a line from Erasmus that said a Christian is armed. If he wears the armor of God, he can basically conquer anything. And so here goes this knight, absolutely fearlessly through essentially the shadow of death. If they have, even below, they have right by Dürer's plaque with the date is the head, the skull's head, right? And then the lizard slithering off there. But all of this accomplished with a Buren.
Yeah, and the other thing that's kind of interesting to me is that the ghouls, the death and the devil, are not engaging him. They're just sort of watching him go by, hoping he will turn his head and
kind of
get
like
engaged.
Trying to taunt him, but he's
taunting him, but not like actively poking him with the glaive.
Right, but it's almost as though he's got his spiritual blinders on. I mean, like, literally that helmet, which and the armor, which looks so wonderfully like any of the mercenary Germans that were down in Venice land, which were working at the time. That looks like totally German armor with its highlights and its the rivulets in the thigh covers and all of the various trappings of an actual knight. It's alarmingly accurate.
It's amazing. And I know we're going to get to the horse, which is straight out of Venice, right?
Right, absolutely. But what were you going to say about, look at this, I mean, Anne's got it blown up a bazillion percent.
Well, that's what I was going to say. So I have pulled up this print via the Metropolitan Museum of Art's webpage, and they have a function where you can zoom in really, really, really tight if you want to get in and really check out the weird curled horns of, the devil, etc.
Mm-hmm. I just noticed, if you zoom in tighter, if you can, isn't that a bell that's on the back side of the horse?
Sure is.
And it looks like there's something.
Like a reindeer bell, right?
Yeah, and it almost looks like there's some kind of inscription on the. We can't even get into that. We don't have time. But it's so worth.
It's a lot to take in.
It's absolute necessity that you. Oh my Lord! Look at how the cross contours and the dots and the dashes describe this equine anatomy. I mean, the flanks of this thing, you can sense that they shudder as they hit the floor. They're big, heavy, beautiful steed. And so what I like to show my students is that, Dürer had spent some time in Venice, just a few years earlier. And so I'll pull up this equestrian monument, this huge bronze monument to Bartolomeo Colleone, which Verrocchio had created and was installed in 1488. And Colleoni was a condottiere. He was a leader of men. And he's on this vast, wonderful, strong horse, and it's got an incredibly literal kind of portrait of an officer. Well, that's on a 13-foot pedestal in Venice. But if you were to compare that three-dimensional horse to the one that Dürer creates in 2 dimensions on a piece of paper carved into copper, 7 by 9 inches, it's astonishingly literal, but such a literal, but such a wicked translation of 3 into 2 dimensions.
But it's interesting. I'm just noticing that the gait of the horse is changed. See,
you think?
So he's got the the bronze statue. The left foreleg is up, and the back leg is forward.
Oh, he switched the back and forth.
He switched the back legs.
I wonder, but barely. That is interesting. The front two, that is peculiar. I wonder why.
Well, I think because a horse gaits this way, not this way. I think Dürer is correcting.
Oh, that would make sense because that horse would fall over, wouldn't it?
Right.
Uh-oh, now we're going to have to go blame Verrocchio for the death of how many Venetians that didn't fall because
there's somebody's new dissertation topic.
You can thank Anne Shafer for that one on this very day, September, I don't know what. But the point is that he's seen, this is the way an artist goes through the world, noticing. I tell my students, your job is to be trained observers. And Dürer is by far one of the most observant of any artist we've seen to this point. So, he's bringing the Venetian experience back. He's bringing his Italian experience back. Just so then if we were to compare the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse to this new print, and we look at these prints that are 15 years apart, 14 years apart, 15 years apart, it's like night and day. One has it's clearly galloping out of the medieval, and one is squarely in the concept of the Renaissance. And it's not the Northern Renaissance, and it's not the Italian Renaissance. It's a Renaissance, and it's absolutely the high Renaissance, in Germany, right, with Dürer, this international art star who has been the one to cross the Alps not once but twice. So it's an exquisite amalgam of intellect of the humanists, of his reading, of transcribing different kinds of symbols into something that would be legible to a viewer. And I love how you just pointed out how the pale horse looks like the pale horse in this print, but the rest tells you he's taken it up 18 notches.
Yeah, for sure. And he's sampling, I'm sure you've said this, but I can't remember because we've had this discussion several times now, that the weird ghoul, devil, death peoples are straight out of the Schongauer, St. Anthony Tempted, and the horse, straight out of Venice. It's, he's absorbing, and
he's a perfect sponge.
Yeah.
But it's a really original sponge. And he's wringing himself out. He's not just soaking it up and then not able to put it together.
He delivers.
He distills it into this really supreme product. Mm-hmm. And he actually does that with the next one in the cycle, which some would say is a cycle. Some would say they don't belong together, but I think that they absolutely have to belong together because
it makes too much sense.
It makes way too much sense together. They're of a very similar size. And the second print in this, the Great Three, is the Saint Jerome and his study, and that comes from 1514. Here's Dürer, a whopping 43.
Oh, 43?
Yeah, it's 1514, right?
Well, a life expectancy is 40.
So I think he's at the absolute apogee of his skill and his intellectual abilities he's gotten all those experiences, and it's like everything. This is almost like his dissertation, know.
He's got to get it out before it's too late.
Before it's too late, because every one of these reminds you. Remember, you will die.
Right, because there's an hourglass with sand ticking away, and each one
all of them, and each, I believe, at least 2 of them have the skull, the death's head, which is that vanitas, that memento mori. Remember, you will die. Time is fleeting, and don't squander it. So, if we look at St. Jerome and his study, which is, we had this magnificent exterior image of this knight, traveling unfazed through the valley of the shadow of death, with what I like to say, the courage of his convictions.
Right.
Just absolutely unshakable. In this image, we have a person with the courage of his intent. He can't be shaken from his task. This is St. Jerome, beautifully focused over a little bitty desk in the middle background, of a stunning interior of 1513. The ceiling, it's all done in this wonderful, almost 3-point perspective, but the room evaporates away from us, just with a wooden beamed ceiling where the signature of the wood is apparent. The left-hand wall coming in at this marvelous sort of 60-degree angle with the arched window, all the panels of which are made up of these bottle-bottom glass orbs that hook together, and the sunlight spills through those into the room, to this setting where the monk is seated at his desk with a tiny little crucifix on the corner, emanating his own enlightenment, his own illumination as he is translating the Bible, as a St. Jerome translating the Bible into Latin in 386 of the Common Era. St. Jerome, and we know it's St. Jerome because we've got his attributes, right?
Right. The lion there.
The lion that he met out in the desert. Remember we talked about him in the prior episode, talking about him slamming on his chest with a rock.
Right.
Well, there's the lion, but look at this happy big kitty with his lions. I mean, he's all asleep, and next to him is a little sleeping dog looking well-fed and happy. But this time it looks like a corgi, I think, don't you think?
It does. But they're at peace.
They're totally asleep, and they're not, they're there to protect if they needed to. There's Dürer's monogram on a tablet laying on the floor in perspective, leading us back to St. Jerome at his desk. And his other attribute, the cardinal's hat, which is hanging on the wall behind, because he was one of the first cardinals of the Catholic Church. And then if you really zoom in, and Anne will be able to let us know that with our fabulous links.
Yeah, I'm back on the Met's site looking at their St. Jerome,
and
really zoomed in.
This little strip of leather is tacked to the wall, and tucked into that are letters and writings and scissors and a little scroll. And there's a dust brush, and there's crystal beads, for praying, maybe a rosary.
Right.
And then, there's a shelf above with various unguents and candlesticks. And then up in the corner, this strange round form, which is absolutely essential to the composition, and also echoes beautifully off of itself and the cardinal's hat and the top of St. Jerome's head and the death's head, and even down into the animals, is this gourd, very large gourd with obscenely beautiful spiraling vines. It's hanging from the ceiling.
Yeah.
Now, that seems incongruous.
It does. I mean, it's a little canted out to you, so you see the bottom of it. Probably a little too much for the perspective.
Maybe.
But I'm not going to complain.
We can't complain because it looks so right.
But look, the only thing that I've never noticed until today is the shadow of the desk, and then the bright bit of sunlight that just catches the corner of that one tasseled pillow.
Yep.
I mean, it's
obscene.
Every time you look at it, you're like, what?
Yeah. So then you have the natural light coming in the window and casting the shadow of the desk on the floor. And the little slippers, the slippers are off also because he's on sacred ground. Remember that little bit from the Arnolfini wedding portrait?
Oh, right.
That also indicates, and look, it's their little toes. Oh, good for you. Look at this little, So then the idea that he's emitting his own light is also very telling.
It's like his own light and daylight, and there's no candles. There's it's like in the light of day, I am exposing the word of God to all. And the reason that silly gourd is there is because Dürer is putting together these various bits of knowledge of the past, where the gourd was a mistranslation of a symbol that was mentioned in the book of Jonah, and how the gourd or ivy or whatever it was protected him from the sunlight. Well, it's used here, and as Anne has just pointed out, that it's a way of Dürer translating properly this scene for us to be able to see this sacred moment of the Bible being translated from Hebrew and Greek into Latin, which was the language of the people. It was the Vulgate, the Bible that anyone of letters could read from the 4th century forward. Another wonderful thing to do is compare the same scene, same subject matter, St. Jerome, the Bibles, the lion, and in this case, from 1493, it's a woodcut that Dürer had done. And I love to compare this for my students so that they realize, I ask them, do you think you're going to be the same person in 20 years that you are now? He said, God, I hope I won't be, because look, this is what Dürer was doing when he was, 20 years earlier and 20 years hence. So we compare this to this woodcut. And give me a read on what you think of the woodcut. Well, it looks it looks like somebody in a guild was whipping off a something, because it's not, I mean,
well,
I didn't even, when you put that up, I didn't think it was
think
Dürer.
But see, everybody has to learn, right? And
Right.
I found that, I'm like, oh my God, it's the same thing. So the lion looks like heraldic. It looks like it came off a flag of some jousting thing, right? He's in the profile, and it's not even very accurate. And then there's little St. Jerome, he's literally pulling the thorn out, but that didn't make any sense because that had happened before. And then he literally had to put the 3 different Bibles, one in Greek, one in Hebrew, one in Latin, so that you can see that that's what St. Jerome is doing. But already right there, there's too much, and a bed, and the village out the window, the same kind of, but it's too much there. We can't focus, right? And he takes all of that and pushes it all into this one moment. And it's like, you don't need all that other stuff to tell us that he's translating the Bible. And I think the gourd in a way is our clue to that, that he's taking all of that former stuff and putting it into that moment where it will become the people's language. And they're like, folks, it's like night and day. The woodcut is very sweet, but it doesn't look like a Dürer. This Dürer of 1514 is in beautiful linear perspective. The light falls on everything and making perfect sense. It is exactly like the light you would see if you were to go, well, let's say to the best bar in Baltimore, I think. There's a bar, the Owl Bar at the Hotel Belvedere, that has exactly the same windows. And so I have a picture that I always show of 2 perfectly placed beers on a copper table.
On a copper table.
Well, of course it's on a copper table.
Well,
I mean, come on. Yeah. That's why one goes to there, because it's a copper table with a perfect window, and I think that I'm reenacting a Dürer moment. Because it has each of these little details, these totally relatable slices of life that would engage a viewer. And so it's an engraving. And there's nothing in there that's accidental, not one thing. So that would be this beautifully contemplative stuff. And Anne's going to, I don't know if I could choose between.
Really?
Hey man, I'm
going to do this one?
Well, because I've had beers in front of that window.
Oh, all right.
Man, it's like so very, okay, but wait, here's one I know I don't need to own, but I respect implicitly. We're going to go to the third of the engravings from that year and a half. So this is the Melancholia 1 from 1514. That Dürer had created. And whereas we had a knight in the outside world, unfazed in the courage of its intentions and moving forward, and we had this total meditative state of the translating cardinal saint, giving the Bible to us in a readable form. And this final one is very cryptic, and there's tons and tons of literature and interpretations on this. I think as well there should be, because it's so loaded.
It's so dense.
And yet it makes sense because it is somewhat autobiographical. Because there are those that would believe, and I'm not going to discount it, that it is essentially Dürer's self-portrait. Despite the fact that you don't see his actual face, you see all of these things that are emblematic of him. You have, well, Anne, you describe it.
Okay, so, this is Melancholia 1.
It says it.
And it actually says it, the only print he made that includes the title in the image.
Which is being held by a
weird bat.
A bat, a harbinger of doom.
Right, which is sort of floating up there in the background underneath an umbrella and a comet.
An umbrella of a rainbow.
Sorry, what did I say?
I used an umbrella, but that's okay because it is umbrellaed by a rainbow.
It is umbrellaed by a rainbow.
See, we can always come to a good meeting place. So the rainbow, hope, yes, but under that rainbow is a comet.
Right.
Which is another harbinger of what knows, God knows what. It's a terrifying omen of something. We don't know what.
Right.
And then there's sort of a sea, and there's a strange little village hiding back there. Now, what's going on here in the foreground, Miss Anne?
Well, there's a rather monumental figure of I could never decide if it was a man or a woman, but we think it's a woman, but also a self-portrait of Dürer. And she is sitting with his cheek in hand, looking forlornly off to stage left, right?
Just crouched, just
so defeated.
Just, crunched down. And like you had said, you think it looks somewhat like the thinker.
Yeah.
But now it's more like the sulker, right? Because the eyes are open and looking outward. Yeah. And it's total scowl.
And he's winged, which I always thought was bizarre.
But I think that is a form of genius. And the genius, the concept of genius, a person wasn't a genius. They were inspired by a genius. Like the genius of dance, the genius of music. And you were waiting for that person to arrive. And so emblematic of inspiration that an artist is not receiving, right? And then next to her,
there's a little cherub sitting on a grist mill wheel, I think, who's asleep. And now
just
cherubs are not supposed to be asleep. They're supposed to be
Putos.
trumpeting your...
Well, Puto's name is Puto because they're putting out all kinds of joy and fun, and their little backsides show, and it's got its little wings. Well, this one's just all... Yeah. It's all asleep and hunkered down. And you know, it's emblematic to some scholars that the Puto might be emblematic of, let's say, the artisan who doesn't have any work but doesn't look troubled. Unlike the artist, who this should be because it's crowned with, like, let's say, laurels, but cannot make because it is an uninspired artist. It is melancholic. Saturn has distributed its ominous presence on its Saturnine, its melancholia. It's one of the four humors. Right. And so uninspired, she sits there gloomily in this pose, which is traditionally used for sloth in medieval allegories that show the seven deadly sins. She's got that kind of thinkerish pose of sloth.
I just noticed that perhaps the trail of this comet might indicate that maybe inspiration's about to hit the head because it's pointing right at the head of the melancholic figure, but it's also way back in the distance and unachievable.
Yeah. And at the same time, there's this ladder that's waiting to be ascended with this, you know, and
the ladder to nowhere.
And yet at the same time, all of the wonderful tools at the artists and artisans' disposal are right there in front of a block plane and hammer and nails and a saw and various forms of measurement and platonic solids. There's a polyhedron that's so beautifully shadowed by the light. The shadow is being dictated by the light of the comet, in fact. And then there's Mr. Sleepy Dog. He's all balled up, and as you had pointed out,
he's all balled up, and now he's completely withered. Like you can see his ribs because he hasn't been able to feed on inspiration either.
Yeah, and it's there. And yet, if you scroll in more and more and more, you just start realizing, you know, the scales are in absolute balance, but there's nothing in the trays, and there's a bell that goes unrung, and the hourglass above the wing of the genius is just it's inactive. Time away. Right. And behind her is this peculiar thing, which again shows how deeply read Dürer was in terms of geometries and humanists and the concept of the melancholic states. There's this. Well, tell them, what is that?
Yeah, there's a grid etched and carved into the wall of the tower that's behind the
magic square
figure. Thank you. It's the magic square. It's 4 numbers over 4 numbers. And any way you add them up, they equal 34. It's a puzzle.
Yeah, 34. Now, is 34 a prime number?
Oh, my God. Don't ask me math questions.
Well, that's because, you know, Dürer would know because he actually, right, because that whole concept of geometry and mathematics undergird beauty in art making in his day. Well, the point about this print that we also wanted to make is just how the fact that it says Melancholia 1. Now, this gives more credence to the concept of melancholia being a self-portrait because Melancholia 1 had been written about by various authors. Melancholia 1 was the kind of sloth, the lack of inspiration for artists. Melancholia 2 was for the rank above that, believe it or not, which was scholars and statesmen. And Melancholia 3, imagine an uninspired theologian who cannot preach to the flock. These are the shapes of it's a dangerous situation, right? It's like a bat and a comet. This is like in an uninspired situation.
It's like a caste system in India.
Oh, it totally is.
Whoa.
Yeah. But I find that fascinating too because, you know, here we have, and it's coming from largely Italian texts. However, Melancholia 1, I wanted to put these 3 together. And sidebar, this print was done after his visit to Italy. I'm showing Anne actually an outtake from Raphael's painting of the Stanza della Signatura, which shows a portrait of Michelangelo in virtually the same position. The gloomy Saturnine Pisces, Michelangelo, in exactly the same grumpy, uninspired position. He's being used as a stand-in for Heraclitus in this particular school of Athens. But this concept of the artist, you know, as an intellectual or as a gentleman, but certainly not a parasite. Even even an uninspired gentleman is better than a parasite. If we go back to that thought that Dürer had come to the realization that in Italy, I am a gentleman.
Right.
And now he's putting these lessons together. But then if we look at all three prints together as a unit, each of them fully capable of standing on their own. However, you look at the Knight, Death and the Devil, that'd be a moral kind of a statement. The one of Saint Jerome translating, it's a theological statement. And then you look at Melancholia, which is almost purely an intellectual statement. But the artist, the idea of being able to have an active life, like Knight, Death and the Devil, or a contemplative life, those should be parts of all of us in balance. But to have the active life and the contemplative life should be part of the intellectual life of the artist. The artist should be all of those things. And I think that's something that Dürer is making patently visible here, particularly by using this last one as how essential it is for an artist to be inspired by mathematics, geometry, all of these physical and intangible things, and yet could still end up in the state. I think it also gives us a through note of the dog in each, the hourglass in each, the death's head, all of these elements that create a great moment for a mind like his. So thick in his ability to consolidate humanist ideas, Christian ideas, history, symbology, and to be able to straddle the Italian Renaissance concepts and these medieval ones that he grew up with and create a moment for himself with these kinds of prints. And if we stopped there, we could say we're done with Dürer. We totally could, but he didn't exactly die then.
No.
I mean, because we'd be leaving out like the rhinoceros that he made the following year. That woodcut of the rhinoceros, which is reproduced time and time again in so many different books.
Right.
He never saw the rhinoceros. It was an Indian rhinoceros that is delivered to Lisbon, and somebody had written it down on a piece of paper and sent it up, and Dürer read this and went, oh, it's an armored this with legs of that, and he puts together this wonderful...
Fantastical, but not fantastical.
But not exactly fantastical. Right. Like it was the most remarkably descriptive thing anybody had of a rhinoceros. And again, that concept of being able to describe visually, that's the role of the artist. That's his job, So it's just fascinating to think that could stand in as the concept of the rhino for centuries. A couple of his books, actually, one of them becomes the standard for how to teach adults about math. Yeah, but we're not even there yet. We just want to take a moment to talk about this other thing, remembering that Dürer was going to sample new stuff. And so we're going to touch briefly on the fact that when at one point he laid his Buren aside, and wasn't pushing that Buren through that copper and plowing
directly
into the plate. For momentarily, he tried his hand at etching, which was something newish. Armorers have been using it for ages by inscribing a pattern onto a surface of iron for armament, like that of the knight riding through that. Yeah. But then they would bite into that, and it would hold the image. But Dürer tries his hand with the same process on iron, and if you look at the end results, well, Anne, what do you think of these two prints that he worked on in etching from 1515 and 1516?
Well, I think you can see why he wouldn't be particularly enthused by it, because it doesn't get at the delicacy of engraving, but it just looks sort of trotting, pedantic or something.
Yeah, and it's in a way it has the same presence as his woodcuts, but I can see him going, what the fuck is this? This is no fun. I mean, you can think about what I can get with my engravings. It's far more difficult, but this is but part of it was because he was engraving into copper. And it was Lucas van Leyden, who he would meet up in the Netherlands in a couple of years, who said, hey, let's not try this. Let's try this on copper instead. And etching didn't become a really solid big deal until, this Rembrandt dude that we'll discuss in a future episode. But at least he was trying this new way. And we wanted to mention another thing about Dürer, because we would be remiss if we didn't mention a little project that he had taken on for his chief patron, that was the Emperor Maximilian. He'd been a patron of Dürer since 1512 when he got that, what do we call it? Copyright. One of the very first ever.
For Marc Antonio.
Right. And Maximilian, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, and he ruled over the Habsburg territories. My notes here say from 1493 through 1519, had written, and I find this interesting. My notes show, to ensure fame, Maximilian commissioned artists to make paintings, prints, and illustrated books celebrating his achievements. He said, quote, "He who does not provide for his memory during his life will be forgotten with the sound of his death knell," end quote. And
he's not wrong.
He's not wrong at all. And here's how we remember him.
Right.
Because what Ann and I are looking at is what came to be an 11-foot tall by 9.5-foot wide woodcut image. It was made of 192 separate woodcut blocks that were assembled to create the triumphal arch of Emperor Maximilian.
Recounting his triumphs through wars and battles and
everything.
Every accomplishment.
And this triumphal arch, if you're lucky enough to see it IRL, is just a hoot. I mean, it is taller than any room, and you have to imagine being able to see this complete, glued, let's say, to the entrance wall of a walled city in Maximilian's realm. And to create this, Albrecht Dürer was like the overseer and the designer of the whole project, but it had to be accurate because he's Albrecht Dürer. So he worked with the king, with Emperor Maximilian's poet / astronomer / historiographer, who basically came up with the libretto of this operatically scaled image. And there was an architect that he worked with so that the architecture would look proper, with 3 entrance gates which echo the triumphal arches of Roman emperors of yore, Titus and Trajan and Constantine and those kinds of folks. And he also had to engage the help of a, quote, wood-cutting firm, which it would take to cut 192 blocks. Because, so in this case, Dürer is the Heiser, and he's put it all together. There's this massive form with all kinds of wonderful text underneath, but this architectural form with people and battles and stories and the Habsburg crest and the little golden fleece hanging, and all the way up, and we get up to 2 towers. And then the thing that I would always have, with the help of the National Gallery folks, who are so kind every year to pull this out for my History of Prints folks and lay it out, all 11 feet of it. If you really wander around it, you can see that things like the torches that are flaming at the top are blowing opposite directions, which I think is kind of a problem. We think maybe it was carved by committee. All the boys didn't sit down one day going, all of the flames should be going the same direction. Or maybe this thing is just trumpeting so much energy.
Right. It makes me think of, fireworks.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And it really does spark it up, doesn't it, up there? So you had some thoughts about this enormous image being glued to the city. What? Oh,
well, first of all, I was at the National Gallery when this came in, and Hugh Phibbs, who was the head preparator, made the plan for how to assemble the thing, and it required cutting of the sheets because there was a margin around all of them, all of the images, and then they had to hinge them together, and then so I'm trying to imagine some hack from the town hall in whatever little town being charged with gluing this, or however they were doing it.
Well, how could it be any different than getting the billboards up properly?
Yeah.
It's essentially 2 billboards stacked on top of each other with really marvelously small information. And Anne's talking about the one at the National Gallery came in they were filed in a book from 1798. But you had to cut it out and follow the instructions. Just like, press out the paper dolls and create this arch and glue it on your city wall. But that's also then telling us that these could have been all over his realm to try and, trump his presence. Ooh, I said that word.
Were they thinking about an institution like a library or a museum keeping it for longevity?
I don't know. I can't answer that. How would they?
Yeah.
I think it's just saying, I'm here.
The size alone is, at the National Gallery, it's in 2 pieces, bottom over top or top over bottom, because that was as big as the
largest
support can be.
Right. It's the largest flat file in the United States was created for the keeping
of this. 96 wide.
Yeah.
It's huge.
It's marvelous. And so it's quite the finale to a class when I take them down there. And then, believe it or not, there was a second part to this. There was supposed to be a triumphal procession for Emperor Maximilian, and Albrecht Dürer had designed that. Only the first 8 blocks were cut, and then, like with Schongauer and Montaigne. Max died in 1519. So Dürer eventually prints the first 8 plates, which he had control over, and he doesn't pay attention to the rest of it. It's still pretty wonderful to see this procession. You can imagine that, like Mr. Peabody, his Mr. Peabody's History, marching into a city. Yeah. So just understanding that as a propaganda opus, and so we got all of that. And
also, the Dürer's enjoying patronage now.
Absolutely. And international fame.
Right.
And at the same time, I find it interesting that in 1520 and 1521, he decides to take a trip to the Netherlands. He's never been up there. He's done Italy twice. But in 1520, there are notes that say, he writes to himself, "I fear I am losing my eyesight and my strength, my hand strength." And, that kind of makes sense because he's approaching 50. He is 50 in 1521. And if you look at the nature of the marks the man is making and what strength and control that takes and the kind of eyesight that requires, me at the age of 62 feeling the unbelievable pain of arthritic hands can tell you that I can see why a man who's already passed his expire by date and is going to go, I'm going to go up there. I'm going to see what I can do to make some sales. And he does. And but we don't see that much more engraving coming out of him. That's not entirely true in terms of he does magnificent portraits. We'll talk about his portrait of Pirkheimer in another episode that relates to the Reformation. But, the kinds of things like this, the Night, Death, and the Devil, the Great Three, we don't see that again. We do see that he'll make one last effort at a passion that is incomplete at his demise. But it also shows us that he has shifted gears and has responded to the changing of the times, because this little incident in 1517 where Martin Luther nails 95 objections to the Catholic Church on the door of the Wittenberg Church has definitely caught his attention, and it's definitely an issue. This concept of protesting the Catholic Church and what it's doing is an issue, and there's war is spreading throughout Germany and all of Europe in response to this Reformation, the reformation of the church that Martin Luther is insisting on. And Dürer is incredibly well read on things like Erasmus and Pirkheimer and Melanchthon. He also really respects Melanchthon, who was a supporter of Luther, to the point that, we don't see much, but I think that the indication that Dürer was indeed decided to shift over to Lutheranism comes when you look at this portrait of the 4 apostles that he paints. It's an astonishing painting that he gives. It's to the city of Nuremberg. And it is a portrait that he paints for them. Full-scale figures of St. John and St. Peter and St. Mark and St. Paul, all just these 4 apostles. And it is a response to the Lutheran prescription on no graven images, no altarpieces, no paintings, no stained glass windows, that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and that's reflected exactly in this painting that Dürer has created and then gifts to the city of Nuremberg, because what it is his oil painting of a Protestant manifesto. Mm-hmm. If you really, really, really read down into the iconography of this painting, and you understand that he's even used the 4 apostles as the different 4 humors that we had seen in the Fall of Man, that you look at the books that they're reading, that in the beginning was the Word and the Word was God, that it tells you that the answers are in the book. And that book is the book that Martin Luther translates into German, which is the Bible, which is the same Bible that Jerome had translated into Latin. And that's the kind of stuff, this portrait that Dürer does of Erasmus or of Melanchthon, that he reveres these change makers, and that portraiture is one of the ways that you can continue to reflect your taste and your faith and your beliefs by making images of the people you respect. So I think it's imperative that we look at those last engravings as he does as part and parcel of that idea of what is imagery in the role of worship, and how Dürer can put together all of those lessons in what he is that he's making. He's brilliant. He is that thing we call a Renaissance man. He is so well read in the humanities, in the theology, in geometry, in all of these great ideas that go before, in searching out other masters to revere, whether it's Leonardo or Bellini or Montaigne, or who knows. You rarely see him quoting anybody from his own country, because he is the voice of his country.
Right.
You know, that's why I think he's kind of awesome. What do you think, Ian?
Well, I mean, he's a game changer. Yeah, it's hard to imagine the trajectory of art history without him, honestly.
It can't be done.
No.
He is that beautiful hinge. He's that fulcrum between the medieval and the Renaissance, and that fulcrum that brings together the Italian Renaissance and that northern sacredness of vision that catalogs everything that's visible. But it's Dürer that puts it in a framework, in a composition that's readable and intelligible, but also intelligent. You know, there's so many layers of reading that can go in there. We could spend the rest of our lives looking at just those three prints, and we still be, oh, look at that, ooh, and you could listen to us coo and coo about how marvelous they are.
Yeah.
So he dies in 1528. But before he dies, he does publish two books that we should note for you, because it also makes sense to me that Dürer focuses that last bit on what he'll leave behind in book form. And so he puts out a treatise on measurement in 1525. He teaches us in visual ways how to create perspective in these really wonderful woodcuts. And he writes a treatise on city fortification, which actually was consulted and used. The treatise on measurement became the book that taught math to adults and how to measure with a compass and a ruler. It taught you literally how to draw things and understand things in mathematical ways. And then the one that was published after his death, the 4 books on proportion, came out in 1528. But if you look at the nature of how he's measuring the human body, and he uses different body types and the way he measures them and he grids them, and they actually anticipate what is now used for computer-generated imagery. And the same with the measurement book on perspective. He uses visual rays that are used now in computer diagramming. But he's just knocking that out, almost, 500, 600 years ago.
Right.
That's a little depth of field. And it includes, one of those books includes his whole treatise on what beauty is. And he really does put all of his ideas together in terms of how it is mathematics and the idea of inspiration, and how it really is a consolidation, a coalescence of all of those things that he put together, like looking at the blades of grass and the bunny rabbit and the different ways that humans behave and the different ways that humans are built, and how we can rationalize sight, but you can't rationalize faith. And it's very, very complete. To have left a record behind and living to 57, that's pretty impressive,
Yeah.
Heck, I'd be dead 5 years ago if I would, so rock on, Albrecht. It's actually the name of my press. So,
oh, right.
Yeah. So, yeah, I guess I kind of believe in the dude.
Yeah.
Any parting thoughts on our boy?
I believe we can say without too much hesitation that this will be the only artist that will take up 2 episodes.
Oh, God. Yeah.
Right.
Well, he did kind of set the stage for everybody.
He did, yeah. You have to get a firm grasp on Dürer to go forward.
Well, don't look at me like it's my fault.
It's not your fault.
I mean, okay, so you're going to tell me the Rembrandt, yep, you're going to get him done. That's fine. We can get him done one day.
Well, Rembrandt, maybe.
Meh.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe.
We'll see.
Yeah, he only made 300, so that's okay. We can do it.
Yeah, there's lots to talk about. So
we're hoping it's delicious to all of you, and we hope that you take the time to look at some of the images that will be associated with this podcast, and it should make your eyes go all jiggly. Also, when you look at them, try to remember that there weren't images for you in those days. You would be lucky to see a picture if you went to church. If you went to a Protestant church, there wouldn't be any paintings on the wall at all. You might not have any access to books. So to see a print, whether it was a poster kind of broadside stuck to a post or a city wall, or if you knew somebody with money who had some of these prints, how very special it was, and that to create any one of these images took time and care, and it wasn't just something that was dashed off by pushing press on your printer. It was all done by care and love and meditation and faith.
All right. Okay, folks. This concludes our episode on Dürer. Yeah. Thank you for joining us again on Platemark Series 2, History of Western Prints. Thank you, True, for your incredible passion and knowledge about the man. I always call Dürer the man.
He's the man.
He's the man. Yeah. So we're going to wrap it up there.
Ta-ta.
Platemark is produced by me and Shafer, and a special thank you to my co-host, the amazing True Ludwig. We'd also like to send a special shout out to Michael Diamond for the use of his original music. Images of the Dürers you've heard about today are available at platemarkpodcast.com. See you next time.